Hi, my name is Kennedy Elliott. I work at National Geographic, and I'm excited to be here. My first job out of college was editing scientific publications, and we worked a lot with Mount Sinai physicians, and never actually been here before, so it's really cool. It's also really nice to hear the storytellers this morning talk a lot about the same themes that I will, like empathy and understanding your audience and all the pains of responsive technology, which I definitely share. So I work at National Geographic. For the last few years, several years actually, I have kind of become really interested in collecting signs. Why do I like signs? I like them because I think I'm really interested in how they convey ideas without using any words. They're pictograms, they're visual. They sometimes really need to convey really necessary, important information. They need to be intuitive. They're meant to affect behavior. These are ones that caution you against bodily injury. There's lots of falling people, lots of falling guys. More fallen guys. I really like how the same themes are depicted in different ways across different regions of the world, different countries, different cultures. And the little details make for some really interesting differences. These are just general bodies in motion kind of problems that can occur. Got some more injury type things. Some are kind of funny. More ouchy type of things. And I also really like how bodies move, how bodies are depicted. Obviously, they're men mostly. Let's be honest, because women are always have a dress or smaller waist or something. But I like the guy up in the top left. You can definitely get a sense of his strolling, like his carefree stroll, which I love. And the bottom right, I really like. It's interesting how the kid is kind of depicted. That's a child in the blue one, and then the orange one, I'm assuming, is an adult, and they're kind of depicted at the same size, which is kind of curious. Lots of school crossing that get more and more urgent in different places you go. This is the most urgent. They're actually coming out of the triangle. I love this one. Crossing guy. Everyone has a crossing guy. I love the one in the middle. I know there's some science illustrators here. I'm not an illustrator. I wish I was. That's a cool skill to have. But I like how his butt is defined. It just seems so unnecessary, and I don't know why. And the guy on the right is really creepy to me. I don't know. And then there's this zombie, apparently, where he's not really a zombie, but he looks like a zombie. Lots of don't do this, and varying degrees of detail, and lots of hazard prevention. Let's see, we have vehicle type warning signs. The one in the bottom left is kind of interesting to me because it seems like something that's you would see in a cartoon or a comedy show. There's some comedic timing in here that doesn't quite feel right for the tone of that it's probably trying to convey. It's probably trying to be very serious, but it kind of feels like it's setting up for a funny moment, which is probably not good. There's this nice array of gendered signs. Obviously, the stereotypical ones on the left, in the top right, one's from Frankfurt showing men at work and women with children. The hunky guy on the bottom right, shoveling stuff. And then there's this blue sign in the middle about a man and a child. I'm assuming it's a man. And it's kind of awkward because you only see signs of children with women, so it's probably trying to convey you shouldn't walk there with children, I guess. But it comes across more like men shouldn't be with children. At least to me it does. We're just not there yet with our cultural signs. And then crossings, I really love the one on the right. That one was the one that inspired me to even do this in the first place. It's real. They're real signs in Scotland. They're adorable. And then this is where signs go wrong, or signs get a little bit more complicated, because I don't know what these are. I grew up in America. I have a pea-sized American brain, and I don't have a lot of cultural context for a lot of these signs. If you know what they are, I'd love to hear what they are. I know what some of them are now, but this is where we don't always have the same symbology across cultures. We don't have the same literacy. And a lot of times these signs are trying to convey like more abstract concepts that we need some kind of symbol. For example, I think the yellow diamond on the right, someone was telling me that meant yield. I can't remember if it was that one or another one, which is an important thing to know when you're driving. But it's really tough to illustrate or, depict in a pictogram. So, I can understand why you would need these symbols, but it kind of presents a problem when when you have the expectation that a viewer will have that working knowledge. Because another thing is that a lot of these are meant to affect behavior, and that is very, it's for safety. If you don't do these things, you could, hurt yourself, hurt other people. So why does all this matter in visual storytelling? Let me tell you a little bit about myself first. I am a graphics editor at National Geographic, which means I design and report and develop visual pieces for science and environment. My background is more in daily news, but I obviously work in a scientific capacity. I work, with more in science and environment stories. This is some of my team. Some of them are here today. And many people are not in this photo as well. So we have a pretty big team. This is Maps and Graphics. We've been trying to do more for the daily news pieces that National Geographic puts out. And because of that, I've been doing, which is great. I really, really enjoy that. Because of that, I've been reading a lot more scientific journals, which are radically different than news stories in journalism. And I've been looking through a lot of scientific journal visualizations, which are also radically different. And I tend to go through the same motions every time I read an academic paper. I start off with the abstract, and I get familiar with what they're going to be talking about, and kind of start solidifying my interpretation of the paper. I might have a couple questions, and I read a little bit more in the paper, and there's some jargon and some contextual information that I just don't have, some expert information that I don't have. And, whenever I follow up with the researcher, I'm always asking these questions and trying to build that context for someone who's not an expert like myself. And so obviously, visualizing science is hard. As a journalist, when we're trying to convey these concepts, they're often at the intersection of different greater topics. And it makes it tough to kind of tie all those big themes together. It's also a lot easier if the reader has some background knowledge, just because you don't have to kind of start from a more general place when you're trying to explain things. And the other thing that's really interesting is that people find a tougher time relating to scientific themes and topics generally. A big one is obviously climate change. As you can see with this really cool New York Times series of graphics, a lot of Americans do believe in global warming, and they do believe it will actually be harmful for the United States, but they don't believe that it will harm them personally, which is so interesting. It's like the colors are completely opposite here. And I was listening to this other podcast maybe a month ago now, and in it they were talking about the IPCC report, that just the most recent one, saying that we need to avoid a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius instead of the 2 degrees Celsius, and then even 1.5 will have serious consequences. And this New York Times reporter was asked, Emily Bazelon was asked why it is that people don't seem to care about climate change, and this is what she had to say. Oh.
Pieces of news. I think we've heard and we've talked a lot about how bad the news has been and how disruptive and how upsetting it is.
Sorry. Volume. I don't know how to get to it. Yeah.
Oh. And we are not well set up to think.
Let me replay that.
So
Okay.
this was
Thank
among the most dreadful pieces of news I think we've heard, and we've talked a lot about how bad the news has been and how disruptive and how upsetting everything is. But this is upsetting at a global level. And why, Emily, do you think it's so hard for us to grapple with it?
I mean, the standard answer to that is that this is a long-term problem, and we are not well set up to think politically about massive collective action to solve something that is not an immediate emergency. The country isn't set up for it, the world isn't set up for it, and individually, the sort of human psychology doesn't grapple with it very well. It's just easier not to think about it because it seems totally overwhelming and unsolvable.
Okay. So Emily, I hope you guys could hear that. Emily Bazelon said that the main reasons were that it's not immediate, it's overwhelming, and it's unstoppable. My friend also told me about this other, I love Hidden Brain, I just hadn't heard this one yet, where Shankar Vedantam is interviewing a Nobel Prize winning economist, Daniel Kahneman, and who has this whole theory about how humans are irrational beings, and he likes to think about sociology and psychology a lot. And so he answers sort of the same question.
When you think about news events, if I tell you there are 19 hijackers who have flown planes into major buildings, and then we go back and we get biographical sketches of these people and we understand their ideologies, and it activates things in our minds because, of course, there are these agents that are doing these things to us, and we then spend hundreds of billions of dollars trying to combat terrorism. And you say, okay, that makes sense. This was a major threat. We've dealt with it. But let's say you have another threat over here where I tell you that in 80 years or 100 years, the temperature might rise 5 degrees. And as a result of this, the oceans might warm a little bit and sea levels might rise by 2 or 3 inches. And as a result of this, the models predict that climate events will become more serious, at least according to the models, but you have to understand probability. And in order to try and head that off, you actually have to take very painful steps right now, maybe driving your car less, maybe living in a smaller house, all kinds of things that are painful in the here and now, for something that seems difficult, off in the distance, and requires you to really understand statistics and probability. You've actually called climate change in some ways sort of a perfect storm of the ways in which our minds are not equipped to deal with certain kinds of threats.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, if you were to design a problem that the mind is not equipped to deal with, climate change would fit the bill. It's distant, it's abstract, it's contested. And it doesn't take much. If it's contested, it's 50-50. For many people, immediately. You don't ask, what do most scientists do? Which side of the National Academy of Sciences? That's not the way it works. Some people say this, other people say that, and if I don't want to believe in it, I don't have to believe in it. So I'm pessimistic in general, but I'm pessimistic in particular about the ability of democracies to deal with a threat like that effectively. If there were a comet hurtling down toward us, an event that would be predictable with a day, we'd mobilize. So it's not even that it's distant in time. If it was going to affect our children, we'd mobilize. But this is too abstract. Possible, contested, it's very different. We're not doing it, in fact.
So
Yeah, I know that was a little long, but there's so many interesting things that they talked about. He says it's distant, abstract, and contested, and for that reason, it's really tough to process. In fact, by this wonderful Bloomberg graphic, it's true. If they did a piece on if North Korea launched a missile in the direction of the United States, they say that in 22 minutes, the United States would have it targeted and the threat would have been neutralized. So, just sort of the difference between an immediate threat and a long-term threat. There are also, they brought up some other really interesting things about what the reader needs to understand about probability and statistics to kind of pull their head around climate change, which I think is exactly what I'm doing a lot of thinking about lately. there is this gap between what experts have and what readers have, and the trying to bridge that gap can be very challenging and tricky. And obviously that's why journalists try to, especially science journalists, spend a lot of time thinking about people and how they interpret information. This is also why a lot of climate scientists, this is a 2015 feature that Esquire put out that kind of went a little viral about how climate scientists are really depressed and like going through a big ordeal. And I mean, obviously they're working with really depressing information, but I think a lot of it probably is that the world around them doesn't really seem to be particularly motivated to do anything about it. So I think that climate change is a good example of like the kind of struggle that we have to both explain concepts and connect with our readers. I would, that's what I think about on a daily basis, and that's what I'm doing a lot more thinking about now as we're kind of responding to daily news and stuff a little bit more than we have. I think that these are universal issues. So even if you're not a journalist, most of you in some way is probably trying to explain things to an audience and also connect with a human recipient. So you really, I think that everyone struggles with this in some way. We just have different goals and different ways we go about doing it. So ultimately, we want to get people to understand and to feel connected to these topics. And that's sort of why I like doing talks more about humans than I do about code or technology or anything, because I feel like humans are not rational. And if you listen to the rest of that podcast from Dr. Kahneman, you'll get sort of his philosophy. We're just so unpredictable. We're so interesting, and we don't, we haven't figured out everything about ourselves yet. And it's really fun kind of being a journalist and trying to think of different ways to get to, spark people's interest and get people to kind of read and consume news. And a lot of storytelling is actually psychology. You can present the facts really well and straightforward and accurately, but if you can't appeal to someone's like core sensibility, like their heart or their brain or their soul or whatever, it doesn't really go anywhere. So how do we explain things? And I would argue it's helpful to forget actually what you know about a topic. This is the problem with understanding your topic. Once we get more familiar with something, it can be more difficult to explain it to an audience. We forget the questions and the twists in our understanding that took us to the point of understanding. And there are lots of different things that you want to ask on the route to understanding that you tend to edit out of your final product, but that are also really necessary for other people to know as well and to ask. Instead, we use a lot of jargon, or we assume too much knowledge, and we don't make the connection to the readers clear enough to get them interested. And so having this knowledge actually kind of becomes a detriment or a burden or like a barrier to get to connect. And we forget what it's like to never have known that topic. And so I would argue that it's necessary to stay naive, and it's not about communicating the endpoint all the time. It's about taking the reader through the journey of understanding, with a lot of science topics in particular. And for example, this is in 2013. There was a big news that Syria was using chemical warfare against its citizens, and Obama had made a statement that kind of locked him into some kind of action, might have locked him into some kind of action. So for a while, Syria was on everyone's mind, and a lot of people don't know about the Middle East and Syria. It's can be tough to read a headline like this and really understand, especially in 2013, what everything means. And so there's another reporter who wrote 9 questions about Syria you're too embarrassed to ask. And this is a more commonplace headline today, but at the time, no one was really reporting like that too much. And it was a massive success, and it led to many more pieces like this. And in fact, it's kind of what Vox does as its entire platform now. It explains the news. It doesn't necessarily think of itself as like breaking news, although it does. It's trying to be there and explaining and give context. And in fact, Max Fisher worked for Vox for a while after that. And so I think that's really an interesting story, and I always think about that because I think it's important to pay attention to that moment, those moments that you have when you're learning about a topic where you're not quite sure about something, or maybe you kind of bury this like feeling of, oh, well, it's just me who doesn't understand that topic. Everyone else seems to be getting it. I'm just going to let this go. I don't need to explain that anymore. I would argue like hold on to those moments because there are a lot of people who don't know the same things that you don't know, and that find it very helpful and beneficial to have those like embarrassing questions type things. And so I'm trying to hold on to those a little bit more as I'm, trying to visualize big scientific concepts. For example, there's a piece that we did about how wildlife that was in close proximity to humans would shift their waking hours more towards night to avoid interaction with people. And there's this line from the study that said animals increase their nocturnality by an average factor of 1.36 in response to human disturbance, which I'm sure that makes perfect sense to a lot of people in this room. And it probably would for many of our readers, but I think it's not really like a familiar way to describe this data. So the first thing that we wanted to do was obviously just put it into terms of like, what is their waking schedule versus nighttime schedule and how has that shifted? And you can see it in the dark blue. The dark blue is how much more nocturnal they're becoming in terms of percentage of their day, which I think is a much more relatable way to convey that information. And it's not, science, academic journals are not the problem. Like, that's far from the problem. Like, it's just a problem with conveying information, in general. Everyone has this issue. For example, this paper I thought did a great job at conveying in academic journal type of speech, like what the significance of this issue. There's this remote island out in the middle of the Pacific called Henderson Island, and it's becoming a catch-all for a lot of plastic that we have because the currents kind of carry it in such a way that it produces a big swirly circle around this island, and they all land up. And it's uninhabited. It's very tiny. And it says here an estimated 37.7 million debris items weighing a total of 17.6 tons are currently present on Henderson, with up to 26.8 new items per meter accumulating daily, rarely visited by humans, except for like reporters, really. Henderson Island and other remote islands may be sinks for some of the world's increasing volume of waste. I was like, oh, that really contextualizes it pretty well. It's also really helpful to understand your topical, like who your audience is and what their topical literacy is, obviously. Although if your reader is someone who is a little bit more expert in what you're trying to convey, that doesn't give you the excuse to use jargony words that are still unable to kind of, you're unable to feel in relative terms. So I think that you should still try to make things as relatable as possible, even if you are working with a more expert readership. Visual literacy is obviously something else to take into account, like how progressive or how much can you really shake things up with your visual cues, which is what I think about a lot. For example, this past election, I saw a lot of House election maps that were defaulting to the cartogram view, which I worked a few elections many years ago, and even adding a cartogram at the time was a little controversial because people don't really know how to read them. And this is Bloomberg. I think 538 also did the same thing, although I might be wrong about that. But there are a couple others that defaulted to cartogram, and I think it fits their audience a little bit. Like, their audience is familiar with what this would mean or can figure it out pretty quickly, and they actually prefer this view, which I thought was a really interesting trend. It's kind of cool to see, like, just over the last 10 years that this has happened. New York Times had an interesting take on the cartogram that I thought was really cool. They spaced them out a little bit more so that people, like, one of the complaints that people have is that it's hard to kind of find your state or find your geographical location, which is kind of the point because you're trying to you're trying to set all of the geography on the same scale, but I think spreading it out a little bit helped with identification. Also, another thing that I thought was really cool was that this is 538, and they were trying to take a more nuanced approach to reporting about forecasting. I know with the last presidential election, there was a lot of confusion over the polling and the predictions that were happening. I think, like the famous New York Times needle that everyone, gives everyone a little bit of a scare these days. Like they, I think, started off the night with Clinton with an 85% chance of taking the presidency, and then by 8 p.m., Trump had a 95% chance. So I think people were really confused about why the swing happened. In this podcast that I get all my news from podcasting these days, The Daily, I don't know if any of you guys listen to that, but there is a great episode called The Problem with Polling. And Nate Cohen on there was saying that, well, it's, I'm not really that shocked by that, because I think it's just more of it. Yeah, there was a messaging problem that the media was kind of latching on to, like this assurance that Clinton was going to win. But really, like the probability of Trump with 15% is quite remarkable. Like that's a substantial probability that he'll win. And he said that if you're down by 1 touchdown at the beginning of the fourth quarter, that's about a 15. I don't know what that means because I don't watch sports, but maybe some of you will do better with that. But you wouldn't turn off the game. You would still think that anyone has a chance of winning. And he also said that if there's a 15% chance of a hurricane, then you're already at a hurricane warning, which we all kind of feel like that's a little bit more grave. So we can't depend on audiences to have this like working knowledge, and we can do better at trying to describe it. And I think it's really cool that they were trying to do that. And clearly people got a little out of control with the messaging around that, but I don't think the polling or the numbers were necessarily the problem. It just was the understanding of that probability still means that anything can happen if there's, a certain amount of margin. That's also why we have this weird, like everyone would know that this means to save your file. And we have this weird deprecated technology that we use like in place of the notion to save things. Like save is actually kind of a hard thing to depict visually. So we're fortunate that we have this symbology and we all kind of have embraced it and understood it now. Same with the search magnifying glass and the little thing that we call the hamburger up there. We know what these mean by now, but they're kind of hard things to, like if someone kind of came out of the woods who's been living there for the last 40 years, they wouldn't understand why a magnifying glass is there or these 3 lines and what that means on the site. So it's like, when we have a sign like this, it makes me think that they're trying to tell me to download a truck because it's kind of worked in reverse, and now I identify that sign with download. So it's good that we're starting to kind of form these symbologies in this like common visual language for these tougher concepts. It's just, this just all kind of goes to visual literacy and how we are actually evolving and we're able to do more. The other thing is that the medium in which, or the manner in which people consume these visuals is also really important to take note of. For example, a lot of the signs that I have, I've been taking in transit, I've been out walking. This is obviously something that's meant for people to see as they're driving. And so they have to be quick, they have to be snappy, and they have to really get to the point. And I took a picture of this because the kerning is awful. Like, if there are any designers here, you're going to be shuddering as I was. Like, this is just really bad. But so a lot of our print pieces are these really gorgeous spreads with all of these like little nuggets of information kind of all over the place. And it's so much fun. It's a real pleasure when you're reading print to kind of like have that discovery of where things are. And this doesn't work at all for web because you have a limited screen and you don't want to go back and forth between different areas of the screen. You want to see it all in one glance. And so we also have these beautiful things where another thing that's afforded is that we can see an overview of a particular topic, and also we can drill down into more detailed looks. We have these more whimsical, poetic titles on print that would not convey to web. People really want straightforward headlines for things so they know what they're getting into. If they don't really have the patience for it. Think back to browsing headlines or browsing Twitter or something. You're very discerning about what you click on, and you have to really kind of feel like you know what you're getting into before you go into it. And for example, this is a piece about plastic drifting in the oceans. We called it Drowning in Plastic for print, and for web we said, what happens to the plastic we throw out? So it's a little bit more straightforward. People want more linear narratives, less of a database. Here, this was a beautiful piece that a cartographer and her team did where he visualized each individual census city block. So this is a physical city block in cities. It's a little bit different for more rural areas, but he colored them by the predominant ethnicity or race. And it's beautiful, and it's really fun to go through these cities that he picked out and kind of connect the colors, and the text that he wrote was really cool. It relates to a particular area. However, this doesn't work on the web at all because you are trying to scrutinize the screen and it hurts your eyes and it's not really fun. So we built a tool where the key is incorporated into the text, and so it's a big key. There's lots of different races and ethnicities, as you can imagine. And so we try to help the reader remember what they are that way. And then we also point to different places on the map and help them kind of connect the dots without having to go back and forth and scroll a lot. This is all really important when, to dive back to signs, I don't feel like signs are visual storytelling, just to be clear. I don't feel like there's a lot of overlap in what the goals are, but they serve a particular purpose. They're very instructional. They're like warnings or alerts or important information. But they do remind us, like for this one, I found out that this is an indicator of where the fire hose is. And that's obviously really important, and it actually kind of makes, I can understand why that would look like that. I just have no idea what that means. And so it kind of, these things remind us to stay naive and with our readers, with our viewers, and kind of think about what they might know and what they don't know and what they're going to take with them. Okay, so how do we connect with readers? A lot of things I think are really well in text. For example, this is sort of a analogy that's used a lot, but they're talking about the lifespan of the world. And this is Bill Bryson in his Short History of Nearly Everything book. And he's talking about if you were to imagine it in a day. And that's something that's been done before. It's iconic, but it really helps you kind of put things in perspective. And so taking these pieces and putting them into our lives and our worlds and contexts that we can understand really works. This is the really big one. I think 2015 New Yorker won a Pulitzer Prize for science reporting. It's fantastic. It's about a big earthquake that's going to happen in the next 10 years off the coast of the West Coast. And she's talking about what physically is going to happen when that occurs. And it's really interesting to just she talks about dogs barking before it happens, and just all these really chilling things that are going to happen. And it's just it really sucks you in. This one, 2013, this is about a story that we did on hummingbirds. A 2013 University of Toronto study concluded that if hummingbirds were the size of an average human, they need to drink more than 1 12-ounce can of soda for every minute they're hovering because they burn sugar so fast. And that is fantastic. And there's so many little tidbits like that in this piece. It's so interesting. And I can personally relate because I'm very pregnant right now, and I feel like I'm kind of burning stuff at the same rate. So if any of you guys want to go to lunch with me, you'll see some really incredible feats of human consumption. And this one was also this is another piece that we did on the plastics. And I thought this analogy was really well done. Imagine 5 plastic grocery bags stuffed with plastic trash, Jambeck says, sitting on every foot of coastline around the world. That would correspond to about 8.8 million tons, her middle of the road estimate on what the ocean gets from us annually. So that's a lot. And another way we can connect is to kind of distill all the information and find the main point that really matters here. For example, I was reading this study about how much marine wilderness is left in the world, and there's lots of numbers, and it was, it was a lot of stuff to compact. And so the headline is only 1/8 of the ocean is free of human impact, which is essentially what it boiled down to, which, could be startling to some people. Also, a piece that one of my coworkers did where clean air is scarce. You really want to see which countries that means and like what the range is and, how their income breaks down, which is what the y-axis indicates here. So just trying to have that quick punch. Another way is to recreate reality. I think a lot of the pictogram signs are successful because they try to represent reality and they don't get too abstract. So removing all these abstractions that one might have when they visualize things. This is a really awesome piece about how trees communicate, and I think that it's really great because it represents what you might actually see that helps you connect with these ideas and these themes. This is another one that just came out. Daisy Chung is here. She helped with this, or she did this one, and it's about the metamorphosis of a butterfly. And so I think that having, reality represented is really helpful in understanding how that works. Another one is obviously what Pangea looked like. It'd be hard to describe that if we weren't able to represent it, like recreate it and represent it. Another one was about this woman who, it was a really tough story to read, but she had facial reconstruction surgery, I think 22 times, somewhere between 20 and 30 times. And my colleague is showing what those surgeries actually entailed, every single one of those surgeries, and how the face looked different. And it's just tough to communicate that without the visualization, the real visualization. I love this piece. This is a really cool one. They're doing, they took like some photos and it's talking about how much sugar is in the food and drinks that you consume. And you can kind of guess and see. I think that's just so effective and so interesting. And I don't think you could have the same effect. Like, wow, that's a lot of Weetabix. And I don't think that, would convey as well if you just did it with like little abstract shapes and things, which is what I do most of the time. Visual metaphors are really helpful. Obviously, when this wind earth map came out a few years ago, it like wowed everyone. Now it's like really folded into like a lot of climate and weather stuff. It's just really captivating. The census dot map, where there's a dot for every single person, was also really engaging. Came out many years ago, but everyone just really kind of related to a dot representing a person. So even these visual cues can be abstract. This is a piece that my colleague did about it. So it's really jumpy because I was on my old computer taking a screencast of this, but it shows Cassini's orbit around Saturn, and if you wait for it, it gets like it to be a huge hairball because it does so many, and it's just really interesting to see all that data visualized. This is a New York Times piece that's showing ice melt. It's really, it's done perfectly. That's exactly what happens. It's not really too much of an abstraction here. I don't think there's any like problem in understanding what's going on, which is just why it's so cool and effective. This is another piece that I love about how land is used from Bloomberg. Even though we're talking about these abstract geometric shapes, I think the way that they do it in this piece is really intuitive and really smart, and they still work with the organic shape of the US to confine all of these other non-organic shapes that make it really interesting. So I love this piece. And the other thing I'll say is tell a story, because people really like stories. They like a narrative. And this is one about a dinosaur fossil that was discovered, and my colleague just kind of takes you through, and there's lots of cool labels and vectors on type of things, which I really like. This is about the Orlando shooting that happened. I don't think I'll have time to go through all of these, but this also tells a story. This is another tough one to read, but without using people and a lot of 3D modeling, it takes you through this event and it's really, really, really good. I mean, it's really effective. This is one about the boys in the Thailand cave, and you go through the cave with them, the boys that were stuck in the cave in Thailand. And I think they were one of the first to do something like this, and I was like, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to know. That's exactly how I wanted the information. And then very quickly, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite projects that I've ever done about hummingbirds. This is kind of a similar thing. What happened was our video capturing technology has advanced so much that we're able to capture up to 500 frames per second. That's not particularly new, but these devices have become lightweight enough for researchers and scientists to take them out into the field and use them very easily. And so these researchers that were looking into hummingbirds they were capturing hummingbird behaviors on their videos and then taking it back and analyzing it and kind of understanding hummingbirds in a whole new way, which is really interesting. And so this published last year, and at the time when I saw this video, it was really remarkable. We have this thing at National Geographic that's really cool and kind of like in the movies where it's called Final Show, and the photographers and videographers associated with the big feature sit in this big black room and they show their final work, and it's just like they take you through this narrative, and it's very heavy and really interesting. And so I went to one just because I wanted to see what they were like, and it happened to be this one, and I was totally blown away. I was like, wow, this is really cool. We can definitely do a graphic around this, especially if they're learning more things about hummingbirds. It's so cool. Oh, and there's like this not cheesy, but this like kind of Disney like motivational music in the background, and so like it's very easy to shed a tear when you're watching this. It's really, really cool. But it was just, it's not just me, it astounds everyone. This is just fantastic footage, and we were lucky to have it, and I was also lucky to see it because I really wanted to work with it, and they let me. So we have all these hummingbirds doing different behaviors. And then by the time I saw this, we were planning to have a print piece. My colleague Monica Serrano, who's not here, but she's fantastic. She is she's an illustrator, she's an animator, she does visualization, she's completely incredible. She was already working on this print piece to go along with the print story. And so I, collaborated with her, and I was like, can we do other things with this footage? And she's like, oh yeah, there's so much science that we didn't get to in the print because we're limited here. And she's like, there's this thing with the tongue, it wraps around the eyes in the back. And I was like, ooh, say no more, that sounds great. And so we came up with this mock, and this is so embarrassing and terrible because it did not look like this at all in the end. But I just went in and did a pitch and said, like, we can overlay graphics with this fantastic video. There's lots of negative space. There's actual science that we're talking about here. I mean, it's like perfect for graphics. And I've never done anything with video before, and I've always wanted to. And so what we did then is, obviously I was collaborating with Monica a lot, and we went through the text, or I went through the text and kind of combed through it and trying to figure out what kind of scientific things that they were talking about. I went through the photo captions to see like what types of science could be determined. I went through her print piece and said, oh, she's talking about the brain, she's talking about the wing power, how they fly. There's so much video that wasn't in that video that I just showed you. There are, 20 to 30 different types of angles, which is really cool because I could see which one like showed the brain in a certain way, and comb through it. And then I started putting the clips with certain facts, like hummingbirds flap their wings 100 times a second, their heart can beat 1,000 times in a minute, they can hover in the air for 30 seconds, they weigh as much as an almond does, their brain is larger proportionally than most birds, so they have a little bit more sensitivity to stimuli, and they can also remember things like which flowers they want to go to a little bit better than other birds. They're extraordinary because they obviously beat their wings very fast, but every upstroke produces 25% of their lift, which is different than other birds who don't have any benefit from the upstroke. They also have like a very long, like their hand portion of the wing is very big, and that helps with their power and their speed. Their tongue is radiculus, which you'll see in a little bit. It's really weird. It coils in the back of the head. And they also do this weird thing when they shake. They are able to withstand something like 34 times the force of gravity here. It's really weird. So Monica she went back to her researchers. She spoke to the scientists, and they were helping her kind of map out these new things. She started sketching some things to kind of put things into a relative context of like the hummingbird size and weight. She started sketching. This is how the tongue works down here, which you'll see a little bit in better terms in a little bit. I wrote out a script. It got heavily edited, which is expected. Storyboarded everything. This is really preliminary. Monica sent all of her illustrations. Oh, did I? Oh, you haven't. Oh, yeah, that embarrassing tongue coil. That's what I interpreted that to mean. Up in the second column there. No, it's this. This looks like this. And they mocked up her illustrations, and went through a lot of edits. And I'm not even getting to the technical aspect, but this is what came out. Obviously, we're not going to go through the whole thing. So check it out on your own time if you can. But we're able to show all of these graphics in line with the videos that are on repeat. So you can kind of go through at your own pace, click around, explore. This is a tongue one that you'll see. So it doesn't work like a drinking straw. It kind of catches the nectar in these like little coils, and it obviously splits into two. Oh, okay. So that's a wrap. Sorry, I couldn't get through the whole thing. But my colleagues Taylor and Daisy are here, so say hi to them. They're amazing people, and thank you. And just remember, if you're looking at a sign that doesn't mean anything, just relay that back to your work and trying to stay naive with your readership. So thank you.